Welcome to the History of Parliament's YouTube channel. My name's Sammy Sturgis and I'm the Public Engagement Manager at the History of Parliament Trust. In this video from our Parliamentary Leadership series, I'll be speaking to Dr. Vivienne Larminie about William Lenthall, better known as Speaker Lenthall, who was Speaker of the House of Commons during the English Civil Wars and the English Republic. Vivienne is Assistant Editor of our House of Commons 1640 to 1660 volumes and has especially worked on MPs from South Central England. Lenthall came from a well-established gentry family in Oxfordshire. As a second son, and like many other MPs of the period, he pursued a career in the law. Alongside his private practice, he was the recorder, or the most esteemed legal counsel, for Woodstock and Gloucester, and the role positioned him well for being selected to become a Member of Parliament. Here we will discuss Lenthall's journey to the speakership and how he was able to retain the position for so long.
So Lenthall was first elected to Parliament in 1624 for Woodstock, and then he didn't sit for the next three Parliaments after that. He wasn't re-elected again until the short Parliament, as we now know it, of 1640. Can you talk us through what happened in his career in that interim period and why it was so long before he was re-elected?
Well, Woodstock usually returned its recorder to one of its seats, but that had been with the patronage of Sir Lawrence Tamfield, who was a local grandee and an important law officer, and he died shortly after the 1624 Parliament. So his influence and support was not available to Lenthall, and instead court candidates, that's to say people with support from the government, were able to get the seat instead. And then during the personal rule of Charles I, when there were no parliaments, obviously there was no possibility to get elected, and instead Lenthall pursued his legal career quite successfully. And for example, he was one of the defence counsel in a quite high-profile trial. The government was prosecuting a group called the Thieves for Impropriations, whom Archbishop William Laud perceived as threatening the bishop's control of the church, undermining the kind of church he envisaged. Lenthall didn't actually win this case, but nonetheless, his actions during it gave him a certain kudos among groups of people who were keen for religious reform.
Mm-hmm. And then when Lenthall was elected to the Parliament of 1640, which only sat for 3 weeks, how did he go about positioning himself as a person of prominence amongst his peers?
He came to the Parliament, obviously, with a rather less recent experience than some of his colleagues, which makes it all the more significant that he was actually chosen to chair grand committees of the House. That's when the Speaker steps down from the chair and instead somebody else takes his place in order to debate a particular issue, in this case, grievances against the Crown. And he did this apparently very competently. And he was also appointed to certain key select committees discussing grievances of the personal rule. So that gave him a certain profile. Mm-hmm. And you can also find him working alongside that some of the men who were beginning to emerge as leading criticism of the government in the House. I mean, people like John Pym.
And then when he was elected to the November Parliament of 1640, which is what we now know as the beginning of the Long Parliament, Was he immediately appointed as Speaker, and was he the first choice?
The King, by tradition, had the choice of who would be Speaker, but he had to appoint somebody. He couldn't appoint just anybody. It had to be somebody who already had standing and credibility among MPs.
Mm-hmm.
We have evidence that suggests that he probably wanted to appoint Sir Thomas Gardiner, who was the Recorder of London and a very loyal person to the Crown, but Gardiner was not actually elected to the Parliament, so he wasn't eligible.
Mm-hmm.
So in looking around as to who might do instead, it seems as though he felt that Lenthall was about as good a candidate as there was, and moderately inoffensive.
So Lenthall's tenure of the speakership was pretty significant. He sat for long periods, over about 2 decades, with some gaps. And just based on that alone, we could suggest that he was quite successful in the role. But I think that probably it's a little bit more nuanced than saying he was successful or not. So it would be great if you could just give us a bit of an insight into what he was like in the role and whether you think he was a successful speaker.
Yes, nuanced, certainly. I think that you can give positive and negative ways of looking at this. Negative in the sense that it was a difficult and demanding and politically exposed job, which not many other people might have fancied doing. The time it took meant that you were excluded really from following, for example, a career at the bar, which obviously was what Lenthall was doing beforehand. It was the House was full of know-it-all MPs who were informed about precedent and innumerable issues, and they were very ready to criticise anybody else who was conducting things. Equally, once Lenthall was in the chair, he became, the longer he was there, the longer he became established as a figurehead, and one might think that possibly became quite difficult to dislodge. There was an attempt in 1645, but that failed. Lenthall held on to the reins of business, so to a certain extent, the fact that he was in charge of what got discussed in what order gave him an advantage. But I think alongside all those things, you could also say that Lenthall himself had fairly well-developed stamina. He had good health, unlike some of the people who occupied the chair briefly in the 1650s. Indeed, one speaker died in office after not very long service.
Mm-hmm.
He was broadly in tune with the reformed agenda of the people leading the House. He could be organised, he could be systematic, he could be quite brisk at getting business done. Usually he was well briefed and seems to have understood what you needed to make good legislation. Mostly he correctly identified his colleagues, so he made a competent job on the whole of ensuring that people were named and rose to speak. He usually remembered the correct precedents and procedures. Sometimes he consulted when he wasn't sure, which some people saw as a weakness, but on the whole was probably an advantage. he was quite good about discipline, and usually when there was a particularly difficult political situation, usually he rose to the occasion and said and did the right thing, or plausibly the right thing. But I mean, occasionally he lost his temper and said cutting and unkind things, and occasionally he made mistakes which made MPs laugh at him, that is. But all things considered, I think that went with the territory. That was the job.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned obviously within that criticisms, and I think one of the largest criticisms that was often thrown at him was that he was very corrupt. But at this time, it seems that corruption was probably rife. So it would be great if you could give us a picture of how typical you think he was with regards to being corrupt.
I mean, you're undoubtedly right that corruption was endemic in the system. Beyond that, yes, Lenthall did face a considerable barrage of contemporary criticism, as did family members and his servants. But on the other hand, a good deal of this criticism was levelled at others in Parliament as well. And when you consider the particular claims made against him, some of them were clearly exaggerated. That's to say, at its most extreme, he was accused of making hundreds of thousands of pounds from his role. And that seems doubtful, because you would expect that there would be somewhat more evidence, if that was the case, of conspicuous expenditure, of land, buying lots of land. Now, there is some evidence of both, but not on the scale that some alleged. And equally, I mean, that there is evidence of him positively requesting sweeteners. For example, in the study of Hull, he was one of numerous politicians who expected a certain amount of money, not a large amount, but a certain amount for pursuing business that was in the interests of the borough. But as I say, so did other people. So you need to weigh this up carefully. And while you can find evidence that, as in the case of Hull, that he did act on money he'd been given, on the other hand, I think it's another question as to whether consistently and all the time it swayed him on major political issues, and that is far less certain.
Yeah. So, I mean, during the time that he was in the position of Speaker, the circumstances were pretty extraordinary. So the civil wars and the Interregnum, and there are several occasions within his tenure that he sort of proves his worth to the House of Commons, and also sort of demonstrates his staying power within the role. We don't have time to go into all of the big examples, I should say, right now, because it's too complicated. And we can link to some blogs on the History of Parliament's blog page in the description of the video. But it would be great if you could just give us an example, and I think the most famous example of Lenthall's rising to the occasion is when the King entered the House of Commons chamber in an attempt to arrest 5 MPs. So if you could just talk us through that as a bit of an example of his character as the Speaker, that would be great.
We're talking about the events of the 3rd of January 1642, which became iconic in the sense that they were represented by artists over the centuries. The background to this is that the previous autumn and winter, there was a build-up of tension between the King and Parliament, as Parliament debated grievances and indeed presented a document, the Grand Remonstrance, to the King. The King, in response to this, identified certain opposition leaders and took steps to impeach them.
Mm-hmm.
Parliament resisted these attempts, and in response to that, the King planned to come to Parliament and to arrest 5 members of the Commons and 1 member of the Lords. But Parliament received a tip-off perhaps a couple of hours in advance. So when the King actually arrived, or rather by the time he arrived, the members in question had left the building and disappeared. So the King arrived, went into the Commons. Apparently, there are slightly differing accounts of this, but he either took the chair, having displaced the Speaker, or he stood up. At any rate, he surveyed the chamber, noticed that the people he was seeking were not there, and possibly uttered the words, "The birds have flown." And he then asked the Speaker where they were, and Lenthall, kneeling very respectfully, as was appropriate to do, and with his hat off and generally entirely the correct demeanour, it said that it was not his place to utter anything but the words that the House had given him. Clearly they hadn't given him an answer, so he had no answer. So the King was left with wondering what to do next, and there was nothing he could do, and he had to beat an extremely humiliating retreat, swiftly followed a few days later by leaving London itself. An enormous loss of face. Whereas in comparison, even people who were normally quite critical of Lenthall in the House, and one can think of, for example, of the most prolific diarist, Sir Symonds D'Ewes, people like him thought that Lenthall had behaved with absolutely appropriate diplomacy, courtesy, and nous.
Yeah, he proved himself to be a worthy diplomat.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So just to round up, it would be good if we could get a sense of how Lenthall fared with the restoration of the monarchy, because I know that he escaped with his life where others didn't, but he was at the forefront of business in the Commons for the whole period that there was no king. So could you just summarise for us what happened to him and what punishments were bestowed upon him when Charles II took the throne in 1660?
You're certainly right that he was in an extremely exposed position. He wasn't a regicide. He hadn't signed the death warrant for Charles I, so he wasn't in quite as ghastly a position as those people were. But when the Parliament that was then sitting, that's the convention, debated an act called the Act of Indemnity, which was designed to offer a pardon to most people who had participated in the events of the last 2 decades. The debate surrounded who should be excluded from this pardon, and certainly for a time Lenthall was in danger of being included with the regicides. That he managed to escape seems to have, well, he probably owed something to various issues, but it's likely that his relationship with General George Monk, who was the army commander who came down from Scotland and was most influential in creating the circumstances which allowed the restoration. He had a good relationship with Lenthall and may well have put in a word for him.
Mm-hmm.
So Lenthall did escape with his life and indeed with his property, but on the other hand, he did lose his offices. He was no longer recorder of Woodstock and Gloucester, and he never again sat in Parliament. But you could say that he was extremely fortunate that when he died 2 years later, it was at home in his bed.
Yeah, definitely more fortunate than some. So thanks very much for joining me today, Vivienne. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. And don't forget to subscribe to the History of Parliament's YouTube channel if you haven't already. And we'll see you next time.